Hi, dear students. Hope all are safe and healthy. Let me welcome you to Class 11 English. In this module, we deal with the first half of the second lesson from the textbook Snapshots. The address written by Marga Minko. Now let's get acquainted with the author. Marga Minko, pseudonym of Sarah Menko, born in 1920, is a Dutch journalist and writer. She had seen the Second World War from very near and lost her parents and property. In the present story, she has depicted that loss. The outstanding features of the writings of Dutch author Marga Minko, who lives and works in Amsterdam, are an economical use of words and an effort to convey the experiences of the Holocaust. Minko made her literary debut with this short novel, translated into English as Bitter Herbs. Here you can see the famous books written by Marga Minko. The theme of the lesson. The story, The Address, is about the human predicament that follows the pre-war and post-war period. It's a poignant account of a daughter who goes in search of her mother's belongings after the war in Holland. When she finds them, the objects evoke memories of her earlier life. However, she decides to leave them all behind and resolves to move on. Dear students, let's find out the background of the story. The story has been set on the aftermath of the destructive Second World War. By the end of the war in 1945, some 60 lakh Jews who were staying in Germany and other territories had been killed by the German Nazi forces led by Adolf Hitler, something which is known as the Holocaust. Hitler and the other like-minded Germans had considered the Jews as people of inferior racial quality, enemies and threats to the German society, and robbed them of all human rights. They first put them in confinement centers known as ghettos and then to the concentration camps and killed them in millions. When the war ended in the year 1945, some of the Jews got liberated from the concentration camps by the Allied armies. The narrator in the story is unmistakably such a survivor of the concentration camps. She came back in search of her belongings which had been taken away from her mother at the start of the war. Mrs. S., the narrator's mother, a Jew, was a rich lady, whereas Mrs. Darling was a non-Jew. The narrator had lost her house and her mother during the war, and now she had decided to come back to take her possessions from Mrs. Darling, whose address was given by her mother years ago. An overview. In the beginning of the story, it is narrated how the protagonist was given a cold reception when she went to her native place after the war in search of her mother's belongings. After ringing the bell of house number 46 in Marconi Street, a woman opened the door. On being introduced, the woman kept staring at her in silence. There was no sign of recognition on her face. She, the narrator, felt that she might have rung the wrong bell. The narrator could understand that she had made no mistake when she realized that the green knitted cardigan worn by the woman belonged to her mother. Now, the woman could not deny this. The narrator wanted to talk to her for some time, but the woman told her that it was not convenient to talk and asked her to come back later. The narrator looked at the number plate again. Number 46, Darling, was written on the plate on white enamel. Old memories. As she was going back to the station, The narrator got lost in old memories. She thought about her mother, who had given her the address of Mrs. Darling years ago. At that time, Holland was war-stricken. It had been the first half of the war. She remembered how she came home for a few days and suddenly it struck her that the room was looking different. Various things were missing. It was that time when her mother told her about this woman, Mrs. Darling. She was an old acquaintance whom her mother hadn't seen for years. The woman kept telling Mrs. S that she wanted to save her precious things, and she added if they had to leave the place someday due to the war, they would lose everything. So she promised that she would take care of all the precious things belonging to Mrs. S. Mrs. Darling's frequent visits. Mrs. Darling came frequently. Every time she visited, she took something from the house with her. Table silvers, antique plates, and she had trouble over carrying the large vase. She told Mrs. S that the cramp in her bag came from the crockery. Her mother shook her head in sorrow. She asked her mother if she really wanted her to take all the things with her. Her mother replied that even if she didn't, it would be an insult to ask her not to. Moreover, it was war time. If they had to leave the place, they would lose everything. Her mother noticed that the narrator wasn't convinced and looked at her critically. After that day, they never talked about the incident again. The narrator saw Mrs. Darling in person the next day. She woke up late that morning, and as she was going downstairs, she saw the lady with the broad back. Her mother was seeing her out. Her mother introduced the narrator to the lady. She signaled to her, and the woman responded with a nod. She picked the suitcase under the coat rack. She was wearing a brown coat and a shapeless hat. The narrator asked her mother if she lived far away. The mother told her the address, Marconi Street, number 46, and asked her to remember it. Mrs. Darling possessed a strange character. Let's see that in detail. Mrs. Darling is an acquaintance of Mrs. S, the narrator's mother. In the story, Mrs. Darling explores Mrs. S' fears and insecurity during the war. She took away all her valuable things after giving assurance that she would keep them safe until the war was over. In fact, Mrs. Darling had no intentions of returning the valuables as she was sure that Mrs. S and her family would not survive the war. So, when the narrator, Mrs. S' daughter, went to Mrs. Darling's house to claim those articles to which her mother's precious memories were associated, she even pretended not to recognize her. Instead of returning those articles to the narrator, she shamelessly used them which actually belonged to the narrator's mother and also behaved rudely to the narrator. Dear students, hope this much is clear to you. In the beginning of the presentation, while we were discussing about the theme of the lesson, you have already seen that the narrator decided to leave all her possessions and move on. Why did she take such a decision? Why did she decide to abandon the valuables that belonged to her mother? The reasons which led to such a climax will be discussed in the next class while we deal with the remaining part of the lesson. Thank you. Have a nice day.